Welcome to another episode of Policy Talk. Today we have a very interesting guest with us. We have in the past generally talked to policymakers or researchers in policy. Today we are speaking to a futurist who specializes in digitization, and within digitization also he's done both macro views and sectoral views specifically to banking. We have the celebrated author, Mr. Brett King, with us. Welcome to the show, Brett. Uh,
Thank you.
Brett, I wanted to start off with your book that came out last year, and it has an interesting title and it has an interesting thesis, which is you're basically proposing that intelligence, artificial intelligence, rise of technology, loss of jobs, automation is creating a mass of people, and this would fundamentally change governance structures across the world. And you're talking about maybe a rise of the welfare state to a higher degree. Please explain to us the thesis and the macro thesis in this book, and what are you predicting?
Well, we talk about a number of trends. AI and techno unemployment is obviously one of those chief trends. The other, is the pandemic, and potentially future pandemics based on climate change with the release of primordial viruses into the wild. Climate change itself is going to be a far greater impact than artificial intelligence, systemically, and inequality is a major problem for the largest economies in the world, particularly the United States. China's obviously tried to tackle it. India, it's a big problem. Australia, where I'm from, inequality is a big problem. So when you combine these things, you really need to force a philosophical change in thinking, because the core economics are no longer working. When you have these changes thrust by artificial intelligence and climate change, particularly on the system. Let me explain why. The current system, our principle of the way we create wealth distribution is through human capital, and human capital is the mechanism also by which we satisfy demand in the system. Classic economics 101, supply and demand economics.
Yeah, there are other
Right.
elements also of it. Besides the human element, there are resource element. Yes.
Right. But today, how we respond to demand increases is we increase human capital participation in the market. Right. In highly automated societies of the 2040s and 2050s, that's no longer the case, because those highly automated societies, demand is satisfied through processing cycles, through the application of artificial intelligence and technology. The human factor is less important. So the link between human labor and the output of the economy is broken by artificial intelligence. In fact, some would argue that is the very reason for AI, is to eliminate humans from the workforce. And as we know, capital markets reward companies for taking humans out of the workforce and making it more productive or efficient. Yeah. So the free market has no mechanism to stop the change of employment structure based on the impact that artificial intelligence is going to bring. So these sustained higher levels of techno unemployment will either produce one of two effects. Either it will create social unrest and the collapse of society based on unsustainable levels of human employment, human unemployment, or we will have to create something like universal basic income or some other sort of social safety net as our working practices go through this significant change. And that's really the heart of the question. What do we want to, how do we deal with this transition to a highly automated society and removing humans from the essential role of human capital to keep the economy going instead of computers? Then on top of that, you have climate impact. You have 500 coastal cities that by 2050 are going to be affected by sea level rise. The economic impact to cities like Miami, for example, or Calcutta, is going to be measured in the trillions of dollars in terms of economic impact. And this will need a response. So the only saving grace potentially from an employment perspective in highly automated societies is actually climate change. That's the only real growth industry that's going to require human capital to respond. But having said that, it's still a core functional change in the way, human labor works at the economy level. The real outcome of this will be that our role of work in the society will dramatically change. UBI will enable people to not have to work to put food on the table. UBI will create a situation where your basic needs are looked after. And there's a very strong argument in 21st century level economies that you have to really examine the core principles of economic theory. What is the economy for in a highly automated society? Is the economy to create GDP growth, full employment, good, strong trade balances, low inflation rates, but high GDP growth? Is that the objective of an economy in the 21st century? Well, if it can't provide jobs for people in the economy, then you would say that it's demonstrably failing to provide for the citizens. So the impact of AI and climate change together means that we have to rethink the priority of the economy from market growth to, first and foremost, looking after the needs of the citizens fully, and then looking at expansion of the economy beyond that in terms of the market, corporations, and so forth. So it's a reprioritization of economic growth to first look after the core needs. And that starts with prioritization around things like sustainability, effective energy management, looking after the health and education of citizens and things like that. So the needs of citizens can be catered for first and foremost, and then you look at growth, and the mission of the markets and corporations as a second priority.
Yeah, I mean, there are several questions here now. I mean, the basic question that do you work for an income or do you work to fill up your productive time? That becomes very important
Right.
because social unrest will not go away just because you have income. If you have income and if you still have a lot of time, free time in your life, there still will be social unrest or there will be unrest per se in people's life. It may manifest itself into global or social.
So let me tackle your question. If you look at universal basic income trials that we've already seen, and there's been about 75, 80 of these trials around the world over the last 7-8 years. A few interesting things come out of this. One is that under UBI trials, that entrepreneurs, people that create their own business, do so at 300 or 400% higher rates than the general population. So when people don't have to worry about putting food on the table to survive, they're a lot more creative. So this is not about stopping people from working. This is about giving people the choice to do what they're passionate about, what they love. That's one of the mistakes that many economists that argue against UBI make. They argue that people are not going to have work to do. They're going to be sitting on the couch or sitting in the metaverse, and this is going to leave them without purpose. There's absolutely no evidence that that is what's going to happen when UBI is implemented. In fact, we find exactly the opposite. We find people getting much more involved in social community activities that they feel strongly about, in creating new businesses at a higher rate, and just basically doing the type of work that fulfills them, that gives them fulfillment, rather than work that just puts food on the table. So ultimately, the argument is that UBI actually creates a much more healthy form of work in the economy than the current system. So I don't agree that there will be social unrest from universal basic income because people have lost their purpose. I think that they'll have greater purpose with their work focus than we do today.
I always thought that you were a optimist and techno optimist. You classify yourself under that category as a futurist. But the scenario that you're painting is quite dystopian or negative in that sense. The fact that I'm not saying whether
It is a core philosophical shift in terms of economics and the way we think about it, economic system design. Absolutely, and I get that, but I wouldn't say it's dystopian. I would say it requires a philosophical change. But I just put it this way, to summarize, is the intention of artificial intelligence, and particularly AGI, artificial general intelligence, has always been to eliminate humans from the workforce. That has always been the intention of AI. And so the argument by economists today either falls into two categories. One, which I'm talking about, UBI and this sort of generalized approach, or an argument that, when we look historically at impacts of new technologies, we've always created new jobs when technologies impact older jobs. Now, the problem with that under the artificial intelligence scenario, under AGI, is that AGI affects so many different types of jobs simultaneously. Accountants, lawyers, doctors, radiologists, truck drivers, pizza delivery people, Uber drivers, et cetera, all simultaneously. And so this is more akin to the Industrial Revolution in terms of its effect on restructuring the economy and the way, work, the role of work in the economy is. So if you look at the Industrial Revolution, prior to this, about 85-90% of employment was in agriculture, right? Prior to the Industrial Revolution. Today, it's 1.6% of the workforce is in agriculture in the United States. You have a massive structural
it's still 40-45% in a place like India.
So. Right. I know, I get that. But this is again an area where automation is going to have
it's interesting. So that's the interesting question. The fact that we've seen the impact of automation on manufacturing, we've seen the impact of an economic system which promoted basically allowing corporates to outsource manufacturing from one country to another. And in a sense, we're seeing the reverse of that now, at least in global economic systems. You're talking about the even for the services sector, the economic system being broken, that per dollar of investment may not generate the same number of jobs as it was doing, 15 years back.
Correct.
And therefore, going forward, you cannot depend upon these services jobs to grow. Furthermore, they will not absorb the loss of manufacturing jobs or the loss of agriculture jobs. So the system is broken in that sense, or we're not seeing it because it's still not fully there. We're seeing trends of it. Say, for instance, I'll give you one sector which has seen the huge impact of AI, which is the chatbots in the call center.
Right.
Now, the call center business was huge, as you know, in India, Philippines, and some of these other countries where there is a large English-speaking population. And suddenly that whole business has changed because of these artificial intelligence-led chatbots, which allow you to do the initial query addressing or initial, support.
And GTP4 and natural language processing and those sort of technology is probably going to accelerate that type of shift to the service industry. Yeah.
So now you can actually have a call which
there is one massive growth industry that will still be able to provide some employment, or strategic employment, but it's probably It's not sustainable enough to create all of the jobs that will change in the economy, and that is climate mitigation. So we're talking about retooling energy grids, installing, solar and wind, renewable installations, battery storage, grid level battery
Yeah.
storage, domestic battery storage, rooftop solar in cities, things like that, plus hardening the water system so they're not affected by, increased flooding events, seawall defenses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, hardening infrastructure and making, your economy climate resilient. There is an argument we made in the book that to qualify for long-term universal basic income, that citizens may have to do a couple of years of national service on climate mitigation. This may not necessarily be climate work in India, for example. If you're an Indian citizen, it may be climate work in Bangladesh or, Maldives, areas in the subcontinent that are affected by, in far greater, extent than India per se. And this is going to be a type of international, workforce. And how this is
But
managed
then they will have to
globally
be
is
paid
the
by an
question.
international organization if it's international workforce. Can't be paid by a national.
Well, understand this, that in the second half of this century, that some economists argue that more than 50% of GDP will need to be focused on climate mitigation globally. And so the scale of the climate problem in terms of the amount of human effort that we have to expend is extensive. Now, we are going to miss our climate, our carbon goals as a globe, right? That's become fairly clear now. And the more by which we miss those carbon reduction goals, the greater the damage to the ecosystem and the greater the amount of climate mitigation work that's going to have to happen, particularly in the second half of this century from 2050 onwards. But already by the mid-2030s and by the 2040s, you are going to be seeing trillions of dollars spent on climate mitigation. Now, this requires a fundamental rethink in terms of governance globally in respect to climate response. This needs to become a massive global coordinated response, almost like the effort that you saw globally around, say, the Second World War, in
The
terms of
Marshall Plan.
mobilization of economies and things like that, because the scale of this problem is just too large. Let me give you the core elements of this. Estimates are that by 2050, we are going to see somewhere between 300 million and 1.6 billion eco-refugees. These are people displaced by either climate change specifically, so sea level rise, global warming, where the heat becomes untenable for long-term residents, and in addition, food scarcity because of changing farming practices and things like that based on global warming. So you have certain staple crops that won't grow in certain regions anymore, the loss of arable land and so forth.
So
We've already lost.
these are not economic migrants, but these are climate change migrants.
Right.
So they're more,
Yeah.
they're going to be more than the economic migrants.
Absolutely. No. So, you have economic migrants in there as well, but most of this is food scarcity and, climate eco refugees. So, just take Pakistan, for example. We're talking about 33 million displaced people in Pakistan as of the floods. So if you have these types of floods happening every year, instead of like 1,000-year events or 100-year events that we have, you then have a large mobilization of these eco-refugees. This year, about 65 million eco-refugees. So the 300 million estimate, it seems very, very low, right? So if you say 1 billion people, let's say 1 billion people, that's about halfway, right?
That's like an India movie. Yeah.
Right. So think about the entire population of India displaced by climate or food scarcity. The argument that we can, who's going to pay for this? Who's going to pay? Which economy
First thing is that
is going
where
to
are
pay
they
for
moving?
this?
The first thing
Right.
is where are they
Right.
moving? Are they moving
So
global north, global south? Are they doing global
Then
east, global west?
that's sorry, I lost you for a second there.
Yes.
That's a huge issue, where they're moving. But it doesn't really matter where, because at some point you're going to have to say, well, you can't deny entry, right? You have to now figure out where to put these people, because if you deny them entry, 1 billion people die. And so there's a false equivalency, an argument that, well, who's going to pay for this? Which economies are going to cater for the costs of relief to this group of 1 billion people? There's no economic equivalent of human lives at 1 billion people, right? Like what's the economic level of which we're willing to accept the loss of 1 billion lives? At what point does that become reasonable, that saving our economy some money, in order to, and letting 1 billion people die is reasonable? So this is the core philosophical shift I'm talking about, that the free market economy doesn't have the solutions to fix a problem of this scale, while you also have techno unemployment happening at the same time. We are talking about a fundamental shift in the way we think about economics. There's no other way to deal with this other than saying, let's let 1 billion people die, because we can't afford it. Because essentially, even if you start funding climate response at that level and catering for these eco-refugees by building floating cities or creating massive smart cities to cater for them and things like that, at some point national debt becomes completely unsustainable, right? So at that point national debt becomes meaningless, because your national debt may be more than your many times more than your entire GDP. So you need to think fundamentally differently about the response to this problem on a global basis. The tools we have in the current economics just don't really provide us with a free market mechanism to solving this problem. The scale of the problem is too large.
I mean, but we're not very good at understanding or responding to problems that seem to be happening at a distance. We
Yes,
don't
this is a core
respond very
problem.
well
You're right.
at anything that is happening. Say, we don't even respond to problems which are happening 10 years or 15 years away.
Quite short term we are, as we're worried about the next quarter, the next year's results, or maybe the next election cycle. That tends to be the sort of limitation of our focus. And that is a problem of modern economics and humanity. If you look back at the pre-industrial civilization, Stone Age civilizations, and even the humans of the Middle Ages, we did tackle massive 50, 100-year projects that had budgets that extended over those 100 years, and commitments from an artistic perspective that were a lot longer in focus. So this is a function of capitalism to some extent. It makes us very short term in our focus.
Is it a function of capitalism, or is it a function of our mental frameworks per se, which embed in us the importance of performing short term versus surviving long term?
Well, I think if you think about work practice prior to the Industrial Revolution as an example, one of the problems with short-termism is that people spent 70% of their time just getting enough food to survive, right? The Industrial Revolution reduced that problem by creating better food supply, more consistent food supply, and so forth. Hunter-gatherers went hungry for long periods of time. Agriculture improved that. So there's been a bit of a yin and yang over the eons in terms of this short-term versus long-term focus, but in our current system, the short-term focus is very much aligned with the way we think about budgeting and economic utilization. So again, I think the philosophical change there is a sort of fundamental one.
Yeah. So your worldview, or the way you're thinking about the future, has changed over the last 15 years, from
Yes.
Bank 1.0, Bank
Oh, absolutely.
2.0 to techno-socialism. And now you're thinking of two mega trends which are basically collapsing or colliding with each other to create, what somebody would call a perfect storm of, the worst part of the human civilization coming together in the worst possible manner. What prompted this shift in thinking, one, and was there a conscious attempt to shift it towards that kind of thinking, or
Well, for me personally, part of it was my evolution, philosophically,
was
understanding
there
that
some trigger to it? Was the
well, I've always been a futurist. Obviously, the series of books I wrote in the banking space were all future focused.
Yeah.
If you look back at Bank 2.0, my first book released in 2010, I was projecting what was going to happen in 2015, 2020, 2025 with banking, and we're on track for a lot of the things that I predicted
Were there any
back
hits
then.
or were there any misses?
Well, one example I gave, for example, is I talked about in 2016 that mobile wallets would overtake plastic cards and cash use globally.
Yeah.
So I was off by a couple of years on that one. As you know, Paytm and the unified payment system in India, as well as what we've seen with the Chinese mobile wallets, M-Pesa, mobile money, MTN Money, Kakao, Gcash, etc. All of these different wallet systems combined in the aggregate now represent about 3 times the amount of transaction volume annually of plastic cards, right? So that was one where I got the timing off by a couple of years. But, in 2010, when I made that prediction, people thought I was absolutely crazy. They said, are you crazy? Cards are going to be here for the next 50 years. What are you talking about? Right.
The cards are still there in that sense. I mean, like, the cards have not
right.
vanished.
But
Usage has gone
right. But
down
that's not
dramatically.
right. But that was not what I was not saying that cards would disappear. I was saying mobile wallets would become the primary bank account, right, for people, and that has happened because for 2 reasons. One is digitization, but 2 is banking the unbanked through the use of smartphones and mobile phones. It is we could never do that with branches and plastic cards and passbooks, and checkbooks. As the Reserve Bank in India found when they mandated, that the rural locations of branches, back in the 90s when they made that requirement, they learned that, for example, identity infrastructure was a precursor to having branches being effective. But once the Aadhaar card system was created, hey, guess what? You don't need branches. All you need is a mobile phone to do your banking. So that's a great example of sort of that systemic change. But cards will eventually disappear.
So we were talking about how CBDCs are going to change the banking scenario and how CBDC are going to change the global fintech scenario. And how long do you think, or what are the critical factors for it to succeed, and how long will it take to succeed if it were to?
Well, so I think over maybe the next 20 years, we're going to see a shift to CBDCs for a couple of core functions of the economy. But there's a couple of different levers here that could change the timing. One is China's CBDC and its connection to the Belt and Road. So if China insists that its trading partners must use the yuan to trade using road supply chain infrastructure,
that's not working very well, I believe. I mean, like, that forcible usage is not really attracting a lot of.
No. But I mean, if you are a trading partner with China, and they say, we'd prefer you to use this infrastructure, and you get all these benefits, including access to funding and so forth, I think there's a case for that potentially. CBDCs could also be the mechanism by which we create universal basic income, because it's sort of like a new supply of money, right? So there's a couple of illustrations of where CBDC demand could come from. But keep in mind, the highly automated economies of the 2040s and 2050s must work on smart contracts. That's the mechanism of automation. And so smart contracts can't use fiat. You need programmable money. So you either need CBDC, stable coins or crypto or tokens, some mechanism. So the more automation we have, the more reliance on the CBDCs we have. And then that means that we are essentially building two pieces of infrastructure: the wallet infrastructure that enables you as a consumer or as a business to conduct commerce and to buy and sell. And the second piece is the market mechanism, which is essentially algorithmic.
So, I mean, the fact that for the first time in human history, you have a currency that is smart enough to be programmable in that sense. It has a memory. It has it can accept a smart contract. It can accept both. It can have a memory of its past transaction, and it can even have a memory of its future transactions. In that sense, So that fundamentally changes. Will that bring in, say, global fintech to play in a different way or different manner?
Well, I think. And Andreessen Horowitz and others have talked about everyone becomes a fintech. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think we are talking about a fundamental rethink in terms of the core banking infrastructure. To be competitive as a banking system in this world, you have to be able to support the automation. And that's not only automation at a transaction level, but automation at a regulatory level. So, one of the objectives of CBDC is to stop or prevent money laundering, right? But this requires not only programmable money, it requires digital identity schemas, and it requires high levels of automation in terms of regulation. So if you think about the way we manage money laundering today, we stop about 1% of global money laundering using suspicious transaction reporting, the FATF, 40 rules, and all of those mechanisms that we have. We are woefully poor at stopping money laundering globally based on the current tools that we have. But if we treat money laundering almost like a cybersecurity threat, how we do network security or ransomware and so forth, and we build, tracking of suspicious actors into the system, which CBDC will reinforce, then we can cut suspicious actors out of the payments networks and reduce money laundering and things like that. So governments, the reason they're trying to use CBDCs is obviously automation, but there are side benefits like the traceability of money and the programmability of money for specific uses and specific scenarios. So, you could give someone a CBDC as their universal basic income, and you can say you can't use the money for gambling, right? Yeah. But you can use it for healthcare, for rent, for electricity, for food, and things like that. Now, some people might cry afoul of that and say, why do you care what I use my UBI for? And over time, I think the UBI will just become that, just income you can use however you like. But there will be some experimentation with this sort of programmability of money and its application at a social level too, I think. But that comes down to this. You can't have smart economies with fiat currency. So we have to move towards programmable money of some type.
So that would mean the end of crypto as a currency, and in a sense, the decentralized finance is getting centralized, more and more centralized.
Not necessarily, because you are going to have competing systems. You're also going to have bartering. AIs are going to be trading time and trading hours and trading utility based on a token sort of economy that's created between AIs. And we may not have much control over that. It may be a black box function of AI marketplaces. For example, a self-driving Uber vehicle, right, that's operating in the economy has to acquire electricity or energy to keep the vehicle charged, because it'll be an electric vehicle. And so how does it pay for that electricity? Well, it could trade hours driven in the vehicle for access or for paying road tolls or things like that, a type of bartering mechanism. And in smaller ecosystems, sort of self-contained closed-loop systems, crypto will work very well and could be a competitor against sort of mainstream CBDCs. So I don't think it's an either or. I think we're going to have a significant level of complexity of these autonomous supply chain contracts and things like that will involve multiple different types of programmable currencies. I don't think it's CBDC or crypto. I don't think that's a arguable stance, frankly.
Let me take you back again to the macro world when you look at the whole digitization trend, and because you've studied it so deeply, both in the banking and the fintech space, what are the similarities that you're seeing of digitization in other sectors? You've talked about health, logistics, global trade. How is digitization trend shaping in these sectors?
So, I mean, healthcare is a great example. It's extremely inefficient in countries like the United States. India has seen some improvement in healthcare over the last couple of decades, but as the economy becomes more affluent, of course, the total cost of healthcare in the system has grown. So in the US, it's about 16% of GDP, 17% of GDP. In most of the other developed G20 nations, it's maybe 7 or 8% of GDP.
Yeah.
So the US is particularly bad at healthcare because of their privatized model, and that creates a massive administrative cost demand or a load in the middle of the system that's extremely inefficient. Whereas nationalized healthcare systems or centralized healthcare systems tend to perform better economically. The US pays twice the OECD average for healthcare outcomes. And so we can address that through technologies like artificial intelligence that is better at diagnostics. We have about 40% of diagnosis in healthcare in India and China and the United States today, the largest economies in the world. About 40% of diagnostics are wrong. So AI will address that gap. In the US, about 40% of the costs of the system are administrative costs, whereas with national healthcare systems like in the UK, it's about 3 or 4%. So AI, robotic process automation, will dramatically improve that. Gene therapy will eliminate many of the conditions that we have over the next 20 years, because instead of treating Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or breast cancer or these genetic germline diseases, we will be able to effectively eliminate these diseases from the genome using gene therapy. As well as that, we will have new technologies like better bio sensors and trackers, 3D bioprinting. All these advances in medicine could dramatically reduce the cost of healthcare. But the way you get those efficiencies of scale is these massive data pools, right? So actually economies like India and China, because of their large populations, may have an advantage here on a data basis to improve to move to sort of some subscription-based healthcare model that's much more focused on preventative medicine and overall health regimes in terms of keeping you healthy than the current system, which is designed essentially to use medicine and treatment as a profitability mechanism, right? So again, this is part of the sort of philosophical shift around healthcare being a core responsibility of the economy rather than a mechanism for creating profits for a certain sector of the economy, right? So that's one area. Education's another area that goes through massive changes. You have the ability to have very high quality distributed education based on technologies like virtual reality and just access to digital effectively that can improve the quality of education more broadly. I think education will be a mix of classroom and digital application. And we'll do a lot more storytelling and role playing and situational scenario building for education than we do sort of learning by rote to fill standardized tests and things like that. I think education will be highly customized for each personality and psychological profile and capabilities that each individual student has and so forth. Energy management and resource management at a city-state level will be dramatically changed by automation. So, there's really not an industry I can think of that doesn't get affected by these, high-level technological automation changes in a society.
Let's come to the third part of this conversation, which is basically structured around three important parts. One is your learning system and your learning process. How do you learn?
Well, I do a lot of reading of things like scientific articles that help me to better do trending analysis in terms of development of core technologies. So, for example, gene therapy. I track the advances in gene therapy. I'm not obviously a geneticist. I can't understand the mechanisms in the same level of detail as geneticists, but I can understand enough about those things to sort of track the major improvements that we're making in those arenas that are likely to affect commercialization or implementation.
Is there a tool that you use for tracking these trends?
So, Twitter's a very strong part of that because I'm able to curate the people I follow that can give me those news sources. As well as that, I have tailored a number of Google searches with specific terms and so forth that will feed me breaking news in particular segments on particular topics. Like, for example, when it comes to fusion energy or asteroid mining or whatever, I'll have certain triggers around that. Also the work I do on the podcast, I run a couple of world-leading podcasts. So one is obviously Breaking Banks, which is the #1 global fintech podcast. And then I run one called The Futurist, which is a newer podcast, but that's in the top 1% of podcasts globally. And so I'm constantly interviewing thought leaders in the space, both from a banking and financial services perspective and general futurist trends, so transhumanists, robotics, AI specialists, etc. And so I learn a lot through that process of recording and conducting those interviews as well. It's a great source of information. So there's a few, but I do, like as a futurist, sci-fi can't be understated either. Science fiction is a big part of my learning curve in terms of understanding the zone of probability. Sci-fi tends to look at a lot longer, 10,000 years and things like that. And so it's a good way to imagine some of these changes that might take place.
So what is the process you adopt for thinking or imagining, as you were saying? Or are these two different processes?
Well, some of that is just sitting around the campfire, so to speak, and musing on these things. Others is interviews like this, where as I'm challenged or asked questions, I'm connecting the dots of information that I'm learning and processing that, and articulating that in a particular way. So a lot of it actually is this creative process. Of course, writing the books, you have to also come up with a thesis. You have to prove or disprove the thesis, or do the best you can to do that. So the writing process also fleshes out a lot of this thinking. So I would say it's a number of mechanisms, but it's the synthesis of the data into a narrative that happens naturally through the work I'm doing, that gives me my broader, if you like, policy type outcomes.
So, does walking or walking anywhere help you in that thinking process? Do you do any conscious note taking, audio or text?
Yeah, I do take some notes, and I use both notes on my phone and computer, as well as handwritten notes on occasion. Mainly, I'll be, so when I'm planning a new book, I will be taking a lot of notes around the different topics that I'm going to tackle in the book, and sort of collect those at various times. When I look at the book plans that I'm doing for various books, I'm structuring the areas that I want to research on, and then sometimes, by the end of the book, I've seen some changes in that structure based on the information I've learned.
Do you do structuring in paper or on digital?
Both. Mainly digital, but sometimes on paper. Just, for example, if you look at the 4 scenarios that I created for the rise of techno-socialism, the potential outcomes in terms of macro system design, in terms of policy setting and economic, that was a whiteboard session I did with my co-author, Richard Petty. And we sat there and did it on a whiteboard, and we basically used 2 axes, right? Inequality versus inclusion, and utopian versus dystopian, or planned futures versus unplanned futures. And we mapped out various possibilities and came up with 4 macro scenarios, right? So that was a brainstorming session on a whiteboard over a couple of days, using a lot of different economic papers and things like that as support for the thesis, right?
And do you adopt any process for creativity?
On creativity?
Yeah.
Well, there are certain environments where I'm more creative, particularly when it comes to writing. And that is that I write at coffee shops, right? And that seems the most effective mechanism for me. I know other writers write differently. Some writers prefer to write at home. I'm friends with an amazing author, Kevin J. Anderson, who writes in the junior and so forth, for example. And Kevin writes while he hikes. He dictates to a voice recorder, and then someone writes that down afterwards. But for me personally, the white noise, and the activity at a coffee shop helps the creative process for me personally. That's just something I found over the years.
Interesting. I will send you a very interesting link about a course that I am preparing, basically on learning, thinking, and creativity. And one of the interesting insights in that is that white noise or meditative music can actually help in connecting long neurons. So,
correct.
And it can actually help you access long-term memory and connect it in various different ways. So, people have tried doing that consciously. And one of the ways that they found doing it consciously is by walking on that thought. So,
yeah, I do. The other thing that I do as part of my career, of course, is in any year, I'm doing somewhere between 15 and 25 countries that I'm visiting on the speaking circuit. I speak around the world. And so when I'm traveling, walking through airports and on aircraft, I get a lot of time to think and have that synthesis. But you're absolutely right. There is some really interesting psychological research coming out about, walking and physical activity and neurogenesis, associated with that. So it's actually a very good time to do creative work is after you've done some exercise, for example, because forms, stronger, neuro connections and so forth. And the white noise is a mechanism we're starting to understand, as you say, that is better for that sort of subconscious synthesis. So there is some real scientific evidence behind this, for sure.
Yeah. Both Daniel Kahneman and others have actually done a fair bit of research on the noise element or the music element, whichever way you want to classify it. Some people actually classify white noise under music, especially Brian Eno and all. No, they
generally have both, right?
Yes. But the interesting thing about that music is that it does not engage you fully, in the sense that you don't have to be engaged with it to listen to it. So therefore, the rest of the mind can actually work on the thought that you were originally occupied with. So that's very interesting. I mean, I've observed that in my own writing and work, that helps a lot, especially when you are stuck with the headline or a particular idea that you want to kind of completely reinvent or represent. So I used it once in an article where I compared crypto with Kardashian, Kim Kardashian. And I said that both of them are very similar to each other because both of them do not have any inherent talent or inherent asset value, but they thrive on trade and being seen. So,
well, you could argue the US dollar is the same, right?
No, but the US dollar is still a ledger which the government guarantees. I mean, the government might be bankrupt, but
it's our trust in government that government is a viable mechanism of value that allows us to underwrite. There are plenty of examples, even during the Depression with the US dollar, where the government's ability to underwrite a currency didn't really mean anything.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a fiat currency. It's a paper currency at the end of the day. Yes. Thank you, Brett. That was very interesting. Grateful to you for your time. And
no problem. All right. Thanks, Yatish.
Thank you, Brett.